Greetings and welcome to Unit 1, Section 2 of Classical Civilizations, in which we'll be exploring ancient Greece. If you're reading along in the textbook, this follows roughly pages 108 to 132. So we're going to start, as we always do, with an exploration of geography. All right, at its most base level, Greece is located in an area called the Aegean Peninsula here, which means it is on a body of land surrounded by three sides of water, and it's in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, which has to deal with the enduring issue of location and impact of geography, because the Mediterranean is kind of a hubbub of classical civilizations. It borders Egypt, it borders the Phoenicians, it has quick trade routes with Mesopotamia. So all of this will influence some elements of Greek culture. Greeks historically were a seafaring people, not necessarily all of them, but Greek culture was. And they're going to use this idea that they're a peninsula and they have many natural harbors for trading, travel, colonization, and fishing. Though I do want to be clear, the Mediterranean Sea is not super great for fishing. Like, you're not going to keep an entire civilization fed from the fish in this sea. How does then geography impact the Greek civilization? How is it significant to the Greeks? Well, Greece itself is incredibly mountainous, as you can see here, and we looked at elevation charts in our Greek map activity. And the islands themselves are also, in many ways, very mountainous as well. So what this does is it makes it difficult to grow crops, specifically our staple crops of Europe and the Middle East, right? Our wheat, our barley, those cereal crops that you use to make porridge, you use to make gruel, and of course you use to make bread, the main food a lot of these people eat. Now, on the other hand, Greece, located in the Mediterranean, is exposed to what's called the Mediterranean climate. It's pretty much warm year-round. Never really dips too much below 50, 45 degrees. You know, snow is very alien except for the highest mountain tops itself. And the soil and the land itself is relatively good for growing grapes and olives. And it's good for sheep herding. Sheep and goats, to a lesser extent, they'll walk around under the bad little thing and they'll find grass and tufts of grass and they'll eat whatever they can find. And you can move them from valley to valley and mountain pasture to mountain pasture. Now, the exploration of grapes and learning how to grow them is called viniculture, V-I-N-I, and then culture, and is kind of a long and storied element of human civilization. Now, the Greeks are going to use these products to trade or export them in exchange for money and in exchange for food, for wheat and barley, specifically from parts of North Africa and Egypt, very specifically. Now, you're not going to trade grapes or olives themselves. They'll rot, they'll putrefy, but you can turn grapes into wine. And the Greeks were very good at this. They had an advantage in this because they had huge vineyards or areas where grapes were grown. And you can press olives into olive oil, which was a desirable trade product because it could be cooked. You can flavor things with it. You can, of course, use it as lamp oil. And in fact, they did in the ancient world use olive oil as lamp oil. And then from the sheep herding, they could make different cheeses as well. And there's actually a name for this type of diet that this and some of the Romans use. It's called literally a Mediterranean diet of bread, olives, olive oil, wine, vinegar, and things like that. And so now they're able to overcome or adapt to this mountainous terrain, not letting them grow cereal crops, because they will grow grapes and olives, they'll make wine and olive oil, they'll sell it or export it out of Greece, and they'll exchange it for the food, the flour, the wheat that they need to grow and feed themselves. The mountainous terrain of Greece also had effects on them politically, in terms of politics. It made it difficult to conquer Greece, so that's good, right? We talked about the Himalayan mountains protecting China, protecting India. It'll do the same thing for Greece. It's very hard to conquer this mountainous little peninsula because it's hard to get armies over these mountains. But on the other hand, it makes it very difficult to unite Greece into an empire. Again, because of the mountains, it's hard for one king or one emperor, one person with this goal of unification in mind to conquer all of the territory, because it's just too hard to get massive armies of tens of thousands of soldiers across these mountains. It's too hard to get them fed across these mountains. They're not producing enough food in Greece to feed massive armies on a constant chain of conquest. And so what leads to the development in Greece is the creation of city-states. They began to develop in the flat areas between the mountains and along the coast. Now, we've talked about city-states before. They are a long, enduring issue in history. It's really only in the last 150, 200 years that city-states have disappeared. But it's a city, like so, the surrounding area and countryside around them, and they act as their own nation or country. So it's the city and the surrounding area that operates as though it is, in fact, a nation, a country. And these Greek city-states often had a fortified city center called an acropolis. This is where temples would be. This is where the government buildings would be. This is the marketplaces and centers of commerce. And then in a time of war, the little villages that support the city by growing crops would be able to retreat into the city, into the walls of the Acropolis, and they could be defended. Another impact of this mountainous terrain and the creation of these city-states as a reaction to that was the development of the idea of the polis, or the Greek city-state. This isn't just the city and the area around it, it's also the concept that the people of the city-state have a unique culture. And in fact, that is what happened. These different city-states were bound together by a Greek language, but they would have different dialects, kind of like a Northern and Southern American dialect are different. We can tell when someone's from the South or the North based on how they speak. The Greeks had a very similar thing as well. They would all worship the same gods, right? Zeus as the head god, etc. But they also had some unique elements. They had different governments in the different city-states. Each city-state had their own patron god or goddess. In the case of Athens, it was, of course, Athena. In the case of Sparta, one of the other famous city-states, they worshipped, of course, Zeus, but they also put a lot of presence on the demigod Hercules, or as the Greeks called him, Heracles. So Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Argos, Thebes, all of these are major city-states throughout history. The most important ones that we're going to spend a lot of time on is Athens and Sparta, because they kind of take a central role. Other impacts of geography are dealing with both the mountainous terrain and the location in the Mediterranean. So the Greeks located in the Mediterranean Sea are very open to cultural diffusion, right? Right smack dab in the middle of all these civilizations. You had Babylon, you had Sumer, you had the Hittites, you have the Phoenicians, you have the Egyptians, all these powerful ancient civilizations. Their ideas and their technologies will diffuse to the peninsula of the Greeks and the islands of the Greeks. From the Phoenicians specifically, they'll get the idea of having an alphabet. So a written language where each symbol is a sound, like we have. And in fact, a lot of the English alphabet or American alphabet is adopted from parts of the Greek and Roman alphabet. They learned how to create sailing ships called galleys or triremes. And so what this does is place the Greeks in an advanced setting right from the get-go. Because they can absorb these technologies and ideas from other civilizations, they're going to start relatively advanced, and that's going to allow them to project forward and discover new things and become kind of a golden age of civilization eventually. Because of their central location in the Mediterranean, they're also easily able to trade, specifically for food, wheat and barley, mostly coming from either their colonies in North Africa or, of course, coming from Egypt. And they're also able to trade for wealth. It is going to make them wealthy. The main exports, as I've said, were wine and olive oil, and they also exported metal goods. They had access to gold, silver, and as well as some elements of tin and copper, and artisan goods like, basically metal armor, spear tips, finely worked jewelry, and especially vases and things like that. Another impact of this geography is the Greek colonies. Because food and good land were scarce in Greece, the Greeks are going to go through periods of colonization where every third and fourth son and third and fourth daughter in a family are going to be sent outward. There's just not enough land in Greece to support everyone. So they load up ships with colonists, they load them up with supplies, tools, weapons, whatever they would need, and they just basically go tell them, find another city. And they did. They found colonies all over the Mediterranean, across the Black Sea. In southern Italy are the famous Greek colonies, all along the coast of Asia Minor, or what we present day call Turkey or Anatolia. And they founded these colonies, which allows them to spread Greek ideas and culture. And that's a key idea, right? Our cultural diffusion, the spread of the alphabet, the spread of these sailing ships, the spread of ideas like philosophy, science, math, etc., which we'll get into a little bit more later. So it is important to understand the Greeks by understanding civilizations that influenced them and kind of the precursor to what we call classical Greece. One of these were the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans were a more ancient form of the Greek people. They developed a series of city-states and a kingdom in the southern portion of Greece's peninsula called the Peloponnesus. And we have a lot of archaeological evidence on these guys. We know that in the flatter areas around their cities, they farmed wheat and barley to make bread, that they raised sheep for food, clothing, and cheese. And we know they built massive walled cities because, well, we found the walls. We know they had access to advanced metalworking or metallurgy, specifically with a lot of bronze. We found tons of bronze artifacts and some iron as well, but mostly bronze. And we know they were warlike because we found literally tons of weapons. We have multiple stories or epics talking about their warlike nature. And you don't build giant 8-foot thick city walls unless you're expecting war. Here you have kind of that crazy evidence of that bronze working. This is a burial mask. So after someone had passed away, they would press beeswax against their face to create a mold and then would pour molten bronze into that mold to create a lifelike impression of what the dead person looked like. And these would be worn at certain family occasions and parades and things like that to kind of bring back the idea of the ancestor. And here you just have more of this archaeological evidence or artifacts that the Mycenaeans were warlike, all these swords, spear tips, etc., these incredible suits of armor, just very heavy, 80, 90 pounds, thick bronze plates, giant bronze shield. But, this guy's basically a walking tank. The only way you're going to get in is through the eyes or maybe the underarm if he raises his arm up high. The other reason Mycenaean civilization is so crucial to our understanding of the Greeks deals with the Homeric epics. Homer was a blind poet, so he didn't write anything down, but he created or is credited with creating two famous stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey. These are epic poems, not like epic, bro, but epic in the sense that they are very long and they describe very cataclysmic events in early Greek history, events that deal with the gods and heroes and demigods. And this poem, specifically the Iliad, is about this great war between the Mycenaeans, the Greeks, and between a city-state of Troy located in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. And, it's a very elaborate story. There's the Trojan horse, which is famously how the war is finally ended. You have heroes like Achilles and Hector and Agamemnon, all these famous Greek names dealing with this heroic style of fighting, kind of individual champion versus individual champion. But why this epic is important deals more with what we can use to learn about Greek culture. Even though epics are, in fact, not all real, they talk about gods rushing in and saving people and gods punishing people and lightning bolts and windstorms saving people from arrows flying. We can still read these and learn about the culture of the given civilization. When they describe a feast, we are learning what they ate. When they describe how they conducted religious ceremonies or burial customs. We know that from this, the Greeks were very careful with the bodies of the dead, that they would sew up wounds if they could, that they would wash dead bodies and cover them with a small layer of oil to keep them clean and make them look shiny and nice. They would comb their hair and do their hair because they thought how you entered the afterlife was what your body and what your existence would be in the afterlife. We can learn of social norms that even after a brutal fight, both sides allowed a temporary peace so that the dead bodies could be recovered and taken care of carefully. We learn about weapons, technology level. All of this we can learn from epics. So that's why it's still important for historians to read these. We're going to take a deeper dive now and look at a couple specific city-states and the cultures of them. One of the most famous city-states in all of history is Sparta. Please star this with me. Sparta was a military city-state. They believed that the individual existed to serve the city-state. You didn't exist to live your own life. Your existence was to support the city of Sparta. That is what your job was. You lived to be a Spartan, to support Sparta. The individual, your individual rights did not matter. Art, beauty, trade, education beyond combat, none of that was really important. And this concept was founded by this guy named Lycurgus, really interesting dude, created a constitution, a set of laws that the Spartans would run their government on. And then he made the Spartans promise him that they would follow this law until he returned. He's going to leave. He didn't want to be king or control Sparta. He's like, just follow these laws, and when I return, we can talk about them, but you have to follow them until I come back. And then he just never came back. And he's like, so they just followed him. The Spartan government was complex. It had two kings, one of which could lead the army. The other was expected to stay behind in case one of the kings died. Their lines wouldn't be destroyed. They had a council of elders, the Gerousa, who would confer with the kings and actually write the laws. And then they did have a form of democracy. They had an assembly of all Spartan males called Spartiates who could vote either yes or no. They couldn't propose changes to the laws. They couldn't propose amendments. That was the Gerousa and the king. But they could vote yes or no. They also had a council of ephors who were supposed to kind of look after the morality of Spartan society. They could remove Spartan status from people as a punishment. They could even remove or outlaw kings if they felt they were not Spartan enough. Sparta focused exclusively on their military strength. They needed a strong military to protect them from their own slaves. Early on in Spartan history, they had conquered a nearby city-state known as Messenia, and they enslaved the entire population. They called these people Helots, and the Helots were slaves who were tied to the land and owned by Sparta itself. Owned not by people, but by the government. Of course, as it is slavery, we can call this very comfortably a violation of human rights. And there were a lot of Helots. They did all of the work, or 90% or 95% of the work in all of Sparta. They were the ones that fed them, that planted the olive groves, planted the vineyards, planted wheat and barley, harvested. They did everything. There were 7 Helots for every 1 Spartan. So there was very real fear of a slave revolt. And in fact, there had been slave revolts that were very hard to put down. So because of that, because of the slavery, Sparta focused on their military. So if there was ever another slave revolt, they could very quickly and violently put it down. They also created the Kraptia, which was a type of secret police of young Spartan teenagers who the ephors, that council of moral guides, oversaw. And these Kraptia would be used to instill fear of violence in the Helots. They could murder them. They would sneak in and just threaten them. They were, once a year, they would declare war against the Helots, and any Helot could be killed without making your soul unclean through the act of murder. So just a very violent, suppressive society for these Helots. In order to have the best military, the Spartans created one of the most hardcore schools the world has ever seen, the Agoge. At the age of 7 years, Spartan boys were taken away from their family. They pretty much would not see their family again until they were 20 years of age. The Agoge was this brutal school to toughen them up and to make them the greatest soldiers. They were generally denied enough food, so they had to steal to get enough to eat. If they were caught stealing, they were brutally beaten. So it taught them to be sneaky. So if they were caught behind enemy lines, they could find food, steal food, and not be caught. They were denied enough clothing to toughen them up to the cold, the wilderness, the elements. They were denied shoes to toughen their feet up. Bullying, brutality were encouraged. Like, if you wanted to fight another dude, go ahead, man, fight that kid. Because they wanted to find out who was the strongest. Those who would cry under bullying would be broken and would be cast out and lose their Spartan status. And so really a very violent civilization. But it did create the toughest soldiers the world had ever seen. And these Spartans would then eat, sleep, and live with their military units until they were 30 years of age. Spartan women, because they gave birth to Spartan men, arguably had a lot of rights that other women in other civilizations did not. Spartan women could own land, they could inherit land, and they were trusted to run households. The men were always away at war or always away at the barracks training for war. So the women actually kind of ran the households, which was very unlike many other city-states in Greece, where women were considered kind of childish and incapable of tough intellectual thought. And the Spartans realized a connection between physically fit women and healthy childbirth. And so Spartan women were actually trained physically. They did weight training, gymnastics, all sorts of physical activities, and they were married off much later, between the ages of 18 and 22, where in other Greek city-states, they married girls off at 13, 14, 15 years of age. They realized, well, if a 15-year-old's having a baby, there's a higher chance back then that the baby and or the mother might not live through the childbirth. Older women in their late teens, early 20s, mid-20s, they are more likely to have healthy childbirths where both the mother and the child live. So a very interesting society. And the women were also expected to enforce the bravery of their men. Famously, wives and mothers would tell their sons and husbands, if you go to war, return with your shield or on it. Either carry your shield back, having won the battle, or you should be carried upon it as a dead body. There was no retreat. There was no surrender for the Spartans. The other major city-state was Athens. Early Athens had a strong balance of good land. They actually had agricultural surplus, and here you can see vineyards where they're growing grapes. You can see olive groves in the background and even some barley and wheat fields. But they were controlled by an aristocracy, nobles, right? Yeah, those nobles. And aristocracy is actually a Greek word, aristokratia, or rule of the quote-unquote best. But throughout its history, Athens was beset by class struggle, almost engulfing the city in civil war several times. The rich, the aristocracy, had all the power in early Athens, and the poor had very little, and frequently were forced into debt slavery. If they couldn't pay their debts, like if Mr. Campbell missed a student loan payment, people would come with chains and turn me into a slave. And it's very hard to get out of debt slavery. If you were poor and relapsed on a loan, you had to sell yourself or sell a child into slavery. Really brutal civilization as well, with this idea that the rich had all the money, all the wealth, all the power, and poorer people had very. To try to stop this kind of crazy violence of class struggle, they created a dictator. They appointed this guy, Draco, to appoint new laws, and he gave them the Athenian written law code, the first written law code. He expanded voting rights, to anyone who could buy hoplite arms. Before it was just these noble families. He says, no, if you can fight for us, if you have the money to buy a sword, a shield, a set of armor, and a helmet, you get to vote and protect the city-state. But his law code was kind of harsh. So that's where we get the term draconian law, because the death penalty was pretty much the penalty for anything. And I like this quote here. It was a lot for himself when asked why he had fixed the punishment of death for most offenses, answered that he, Draco, considered lesser crimes to deserve it, and he had no greater punishment for more important ones. So it is where we get the term draconian law. It means a very harsh law code. One of the most important politicians of early Athens was Solon the Reformer. He saw that a lot of these issues of class struggle could be solved by ending debt slavery and allowing more Athenians to vote. So he expanded voting rights again to include even more males. Again, it's just males that can vote. And he forbade debt slavery. He then used a large portion of money, a surplus the state had, to buy back Athenian citizens who had been sold overseas or to other city-states as slaves. And he opened up the courts and a lot of the higher level political offices to any citizen. And this concept of creating laws that were more open and expanding voting rights would continue throughout Athenian history. They begin to believe that the best city-state, theirs, would be one that was more equal and had more justice for their citizens. So Athens is known as this birthplace of democracy. I want you to write that in, the birthplace of democracy. Oh, this is going to be fun to try to write in with this death mouse. Birthplace, democracy. Democracy coming from the Greek word demos kratia. Demos is people, kratia power, power of the people. And Athens is credited as the first democracy because they opened up voting to the most people. But was it a democracy? Well, all citizens could vote and they could all run for offices. But to be a citizen, you had to be male, you had to have 2 Athenian parents, you had to have finished military training to prove that you could fight, so you had to go through basic training. No foreigners were ever allowed, no slaves, no women, and not the young. So young people couldn't vote, like 18-year-old not be allowed to vote. And so really only about 10 to 20% of their population could actually vote. But we still call it a democracy because it was more democratic than any other nation at that point. And they formed this word. It was the Athenians who created this concept of democracy. Their democracy was unique in that their citizens voted directly on the laws. So today in America, we have a democratic republic in which that we democratically elect representatives to Congress, to Senate. We democratically elect a president to guide us, but we don't actually vote on the laws. So they had a more direct form of democracy. But it's pretty easy enduring issue-wise to discuss that democracy in some form is the majority form of government in Western civilization, in Europe, and in many countries. Whether those democracies are pure or not, well, that's up to discussion. So Greek history is long and full of so many events. And, I've taken several college courses just on different elements of Greek history. We just do not have the time to spend it all. But we're going to hit a couple high points that really shaped Greek civilization and would shape other civilizations because of the advances and changes and events in Greece itself. And one of the most famous of these was the Persian Wars, a series of wars that lasted over a decade between the Greeks and an empire known as Persia. The Persian Wars were fought between the Persian Empire, which is this massive empire that even goes further over here, and basically the 2 city-states of Athens and Sparta, who worked as allies. The background of this war, the Persian Empire had conquered all of Ionia, or modern-day Turkey or Asia Minor. And this is where all those Greek colonies existed. They conquered all these colonies, these city-states. They didn't conquer Greece itself, but they conquered all the children of the children of the children of the Greeks. And at one point, the Ionian Greeks didn't want to be ruled anymore, and an alliance of these Greek colonies formed and rebelled. They rebelled against the Persian Empire. And Athens and other city-states like Thebes and Boeotia, they were sympathetic because these were their colonies. These were distant relatives of theirs. So they sent soldiers, weapons, and money to help fund this revolution or this rebellion. And Persia does eventually put this rebellion down. They crush these rebel city-states and they reconquer all of these colonies. But now Persia's upset because Athens and other city-states intervened. And they basically start to plot an invasion to seek revenge against Athens. They're going to conquer Athens and then through them conquer the rest of Greece and bring another area under this empire's control. The first step of this invasion is the infamous Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE. The Persian king Darius sent a massive invasion force to punish the Athenians and, if possible, conquer Athens itself. The Athenians learned of this. They donned their armor, which was called hoplite armor. So that's their soldiers are hoplites. And they met the Persians in the field of battle on this place called Marathon, the plains of Marathon. So the Persians land their ships, they're unloading their ships, and they're getting ready. And then they see this Athenian army. It's smaller than them, but they're wearing all this heavy armor. And normally how hoplites fought is they slowly walk towards the enemy with their shields out, and they press their shields all together and they stab with their spears because they're wearing 70 or 80 pounds of gear. But the commander of the Athenians orders the Athenians to charge. They run at full speed towards the enemy Persian line. And this really kind of hurt the Persians because the Persian style of fighting was to use a wave after wave of arrows. They were really good archers. They had this short bow called the Scythian or Persian short bow, and they would just launch flights of arrows, and then the arrows would weaken their enemy, and then they would use horses to circle around and defeat the enemy by literally stabbing them in the back and breaking up the enemy formations. But by being charged by these heavy hoplites with all this armor and these giant shields, the arrows are just bouncing off of this stuff, and then these guys run into the Persian line and just smash it apart. The Athenians then march 26 miles back to Athens in full gear to ensure that the Persians could not attack the defenseless city. And we get the actual race, the Marathon, from this because there is a legend that after the victory at Marathon, one of the quicker fighters, one of the faster guys in the Athenian army, a guy named Philippides, took off all his armor and sprinted to Athens to tell them that they won, screaming Nike, Nike, or victory in victory, and that the run was so taxing on him that he passed away. And I just want to take a second to really look at the Greek hoplite, or phalanx, as they called their military unit, because it is an innovation. I mean, it's an incredible style of combat that will dominate warfare in the Mediterranean for several hundred years. So this is kind of what a hoplite looked like. They were a type of heavy infantry. Why? Because, well, they're wearing a lot of armor. There's light infantry that would wear very little armor. And they dominated Mediterranean combat for over 500 years. What the basic gear they had, they would have a giant bronze shield in a round formation. This was called the hoplon, or sometimes called the aspis. And as a solid bronze shield, it was basically impervious to arrows. Arrows would kind of just bounce right off this thing. Even spears and swords would kind of bounce right off this giant shield that could in itself weigh between 20 and 35 pounds. They would have a breastplate or chest piece made of either leather and linen, like toughened leather, or also, if they were rich enough, made of solid bronze as well. They would have bronze at their feet called greaves, and they would have a bronze helmet. Their main weapon was the dori, a long spear with an iron spear tip and an iron spear butt that could be used to stab people if they broke their spear tip off. And they generally carried as a sidearm a small sword that was about 2 foot long. If they were lucky, also made out of iron, but more frequently made out of sharpened bronze. And how they fought is in this giant square called a phalanx. Each soldier would stand and his shield would cover half of him, and it would cover and overlap and protect the guy next to him. In this way, it was a solid wall of these bronze shields, and they would stab forward with their spears. And the guy behind them would put their shield into the back of the guy in front, and they'd stab forward with their shields. So when you fought against this, what you were presented with is a literal wall of bronze shields and spear points, and they would just slowly walk towards you, stabbing, and you couldn't even get close enough to do anything before these spears would just stab you in the face, and your arrows, your own weapons generally couldn't penetrate through this thick armor. And that is the hoplite. And like I said, it was the main force of warfare until the rise of Rome. Well, Darius's invasion of Marathon is an utter failure. And then he dies. And the new Persian king, Xerxes, he still desires the conquest of Greece. And so he gathers together the largest army the world had ever seen at that point. Historians, or at least the most famous historian from this time period, a guy named Herodotus, argued that the army was as many as 1 million people. Out of that, it was really about 200, maybe 250,000 soldiers. There were a lot of other people like slaves carrying stuff. A lot of soldiers brought their wives. The emperor himself, the king of Persia, Xerxes, came with it. So he had his whole court and retainers and all these different people. And they invade. And in this case, the mountainous terrain of Greece, right? Remember those mountains? It's going to help them. The Spartan king named Leonidas, they had two, and Leonidas was one of them. He gathers together a small army of 300 because he was told that he would not be able to bring his full army. The Spartans were very religious, and they did not believe that they could send an army out of Sparta in a time of religious festival. But the king was allowed a bodyguard. So he gathered together his bodyguard of 300, and as he marched to meet the Persians, he gathered another 3,000 Greek allies from other city-states like Boeotia and Plataea, and he set up to block this massive Persian army in a small, narrow pass called Thermopylae. They knew that the superior numbers of this massive Persian army would not be able to easily get through this narrow pass, right? There's mountains on one side, mountains on the other. There's only a narrow, tiny gap where an army can move through. And these aren't just mountains, they're like giant cliffs. And for 3 days, this tiny army, barely over 3,000 people, held off an army of 200,000 Persians. And they killed thousands of the Persians. There was a serious disconnect between the phalanx, the hoplite heavy armor of these skilled Spartans, and the gear used by that of the Persians. All of the Spartans but 2 died. One had lost an eye and been returned to Sparta to tell them what was going on, and the other one had gotten a fever and literally couldn't put on his armor. But this death, especially of the Spartan king himself, convinced many other Greeks that they had to join the fight and would eventually create an alliance of Greeks to fight the Persians off. And I love this. This is the quote at the tomb of the 300 Spartan bodyguards and the king Leonidas. "Go tell the Spartans, thou who passeth by, that here, obedient to our laws, we lie." That they are told, right, when they leave for battle, come back with your shield, victorious or on it. And they all died to a man here. And you might ask, well, what is this difference between weapons between the Spartans and between the Persians, between the Greeks and between the Persians. Like I said, the Greeks used this heavy armor, this hoplite infantry as their main fighting force. The Persian armor and shields were generally made out of lighter cloth. Their shields were made out of wicker, like you ever think of a wicker basket. They would weave that together and sometimes put an animal skin or leather over the top of it, and that's what their shields were made out of. And they used a curved sword called an ankh. And their armor was lighter, and that worked for them. Like the Persians conquered one of the largest empires the world had ever seen at that point, because they would fill the enemy. They'd literally fill the sky with arrows. They were very good shots with arrows. And then when the enemy was weakened up, they would come in with their slashing swords and finish off the stragglers, and they used a lot of cavalry. Well, cavalry or horses don't work in the mountains, so that's an advantage that the Greeks had. And the wicker shields the Persians had, which would block arrows. The arrows would stick in the wicker and wouldn't generally go through. Well, they didn't block the iron-tipped spears very well, which generally cut right through these things. The curved swords of the Persians, which were effective at fighting their normal enemies where they were from, literally like bounced off of the heavy bronze armor and shields of the Greeks. So it was kind of a mismatch of technology. While the Spartans were holding off armies at Thermopylae, there was another Persian invasion by water. A massive, massive fleet, the largest the world had ever seen at that point, was also attacking and trying to invade Greece as well. And here they were met by the Athenians. The Athenians had found a gold and silver mine and become incredibly wealthy off of it. And they asked how should they spend that money. And they asked for a prophecy from the gods. And they were told, "A wall of wood alone shall be uncaptured, a boon to you and your children." And so a lot of Athenians were like, all right, let's build a giant wooden wall. Obviously, that's what the gods want us to do. But this one Greek commander said, no, a wooden wall could also be a fleet of wooden ships. He convinced them to build a massive navy and to train constantly on how to fight in the ocean. And so they have this huge fleet and they win. They drive off this huge Persian fleet. Even though their ships are smaller, they're faster, and they know the waters. They know the terrain. And so they're basically able to surround, break up the Persian fleet, and drive them off. And the king of Persia, Xerxes, he saw this. He knew the sea battle was coming, and he actually had a throne built on top of one of these island mountains to watch the battle. And as he watches it and realizes his fleet's losing, he actually gets scared and he runs back to Asia. But he does leave a huge portion of his army behind under the command of a general named Mardonius. So the war is not yet over. The Battle of Plataea was kind of the final nail in the coffin for the Persian invasion. Finally, all the Greeks saw the threat of Persia and banded together. The Spartans, the Athenians, the Boeotians, the Plataeans, the Thebans, all these different city-states formed one giant army and faced the Persian force on the fields of Plataea. And at the same time that's going on, there was another huge sea battle called Macao that the Athenian fleet finally smashed the last ships of the Persians, and the Persian war is over. Mardonius dies, and the rest of the Persian army flees. We know a lot about this war because it was written down. We have a figure, a famous figure throughout history known as Herodotus, who is considered the father of history. So if you don't like global studies, I guess you can blame this guy because he's kind of the father of history. He invented the word history. And he wrote all about these Persian wars in the first ever real history book, at least in Western civilization, called The Histories. And we consider him the father of history because he actually traveled to battle sites. He actually interviewed veterans of this war to learn about, well, what happened here at this point in this battle? When was this order given? Who was the commander here? He collected evidence, and he set up that concept that to have good history, you have to collect evidence. You have to collect artifacts and relics and look at what's going on. Now, Herodotus, as a father of history, is also a father of the concept that we have to be careful of bias in history. Herodotus was a Greek. He was clearly biased in favor of the Greeks. Like from the beginning of his book, he's like, yep, the Greeks were destined to win. They could know nothing but victory because they believed in democracy and equality. And while, yes, there was democracy in Athens, there was also slavery. Like they still bought and sold slaves, and upper middle class and rich families had slaves in their house that like did the dishes and cooked for them and did all the work. So we have to be aware of this bias. Now, the defeat of Persia would lead directly to the formation of a new military alliance. The Greeks saw that only together, by cooperating, were they strong enough to defeat Persia. So they proposed a military alliance. 150 different city-states or polis would form together into the Delian League, so called because its headquarters and its treasury was located in the island of Delos, basically in the middle of the sea between the Persian Empire and between the Greeks. Now, the command for this alliance was initially offered to the Spartans, right? You guys are the soldiers, you guys are the toughest warriors we have, please take over. But the Spartans didn't want it. They said, no, we're going to go back to Sparta. We have to be careful of another slave revolt. We don't want to be involved in international politics and relation. We'll protect Sparta, but we're not going to head some massive military alliance. So the job was taken up by the Athenians. Their fleet had won several major battles. They had also fought at Plataea, helping hold the line against the Persians. And this then took the form of Athenian hegemony, or the beginnings of the Athenian Empire. Because while initially this is like a voluntary alliance that the city-states wanted to be in, as the years go by, more and more Athens acts like they're in charge of all of the city-states. Not just defending them, but they're just straight up in charge. And the way the Delian League worked is all the 150 city-states had to contribute or help, right? They could contribute men, soldiers, material, ships and weapons, or money. And in the first couple years, they contributed soldiers and ships, and they kind of rotated through. But as the years went by and the Persians didn't try to invade again, a lot of the city-states got tired of sending their soldiers to various outposts to protect the empire, so they just started to send money. And that wealth, that tribute poured into Athens because they're the ones that control the alliance. And they would use this to build a massive navy, a huge fleet, and to rebuild their city, which had been burned by the Persians. And this leads, in fact, to the Athenian Golden Age. They're not at war anymore, so a time of relative peace and prosperity. And that Athenian Golden Age contributes to the Greek Golden Age. So really, these are almost synonymous, like one is the same as the other. Golden Age, of course, in and of itself can be an enduring issue. It is a time of cultural flowering when, like a flower spreads its petals, the artistic, scientific, medical achievements, cultural achievements of a civilization also flower or spread. But it sets the stage for future conflict. The time generally given is from about 500 BCE to 300 BCE. And in it, we see incredible advances in math, science, philosophy, engineering, architecture, and medicine. And I love this painting of the Greek Golden Age. There's Athens, there's its Acropolis and all of its glory. This is a famous painting called The School of Athens, with all the greatest minds of Athens, all these great philosophers and mathematicians and scientists discussing, the world together. While the Greek Golden Age is led by Athens, it does eventually spread to all of the Greek city-states. They all benefit from this Golden Age, from this flowering of technology and ideas. And eventually it spreads through all of the Mediterranean and to Asia Minor, or present-day Turkey, this area here. And it creates the Hellenistic world. So this is cultural diffusion, right? That this Greek-influenced or Hellenistic world, the Greeks called Greece itself Hellas, so that's where we get the term Hellenistic. And this cultural diffusion, these ideas are spread through trade, conquest by Alexander the Great, and the creation of these Greek colonies. And this becomes this Hellenistic world. Southern Italy, Greece, Asia Minor, North Africa, and parts of what is present-day Iran. One of the central figures of the start of this golden age is Pericles. Pericles is from Athens. That actually doesn't seem to be in here, so we're going to go ahead and write that in. Athens. And he is leader of the people of Athens for 30 years. And you got to remember, he's not a king. He gets elected. For 30 years, they keep electing this guy to basically be in charge of Athens, including he leads them into, unfortunately, their next series of wars. He's the one that comes up with this plan that the Athenians, having sacrificed so many men and ships and their city itself in the Persian Wars, are going to use the funds from the Delian League to rebuild Athens and to expand their democracy. And he sets up three major goals for his administration. Strengthen democracy by giving a total direct democracy and expanding voting rights to more and more people. 2, to build an Athenian empire. He's the one who believes that Athens was the best city-state by far, and that it should, in fact, control all the other city-states. To do that, they would need that powerful navy and imperialism. They needed raw materials and allies to keep this powerful alliance going. And he wanted to glorify Athens through massive building programs, walls. He built a series of walls that were 20 miles long to connect Athens to another city where they could get food from the ocean, because Athens itself isn't on the coast. So they just built another city called Piraeus and built walls between them so they could easily get goods back and forth. He built temples, he built government buildings, marketplaces, all sorts of stuff. And this building program provides jobs for thousands of Greeks. They didn't really use slaves or a lot of the labor. Except for the quarry itself, they paid people to do this. That's what his vision was. Put a paycheck in everyone's pocket using this money. And unfortunately for him, he does die of plague at the end of the Peloponnesian War. And Pericles is highly influential to later politicians. He's highly influential to the idea, in fact, of Athenian democracy. His name in many ways becomes synonymous with the idea of rule of the people, of democracy itself. And he will shape then the rule and laws of Athens for many, many years to come. And it is during this time period that we see kind of the formation of this idea of Athenian civic virtue or civic values. This is the idea that being a citizen comes with responsibility. Yes, you get rights. There are rights with being a citizen of a nation, but there's also responsibility. There's also elements of work that come along with that you should then care about the welfare of your community, of your civilization. And this becomes the backbone of these Athenian values. And arguably, this is an enduring issue today. Like, what are our civic virtues? What are our civic values? Well, just like they were in Athens, it's to pay your taxes, to obey the law, and to protect the rule of law, to vote when there are elections, to serve in the military if it's required or if you can, and to lead a moral life, that you shouldn't want to hurt people or steal from people. And one of those famous examples of these virtues was given in a famous speech by Pericles called the Funeral Oration, which we will read parts of. And this idea of democracy shapes the oath of the Athenian city-state. I will not disgrace these sacred arms, nor ever desert a comrade in the ranks. I will guard the temples and the centers of civic life and uphold the ideals of my country, both alone and in concert with others. I will at all times obey the judges and police and observe the laws as well as those at present in force, as those the majority may hereafter enact. Should anyone seek to subvert those laws or set them aside, him I will oppose either in common with others or alone. In these ways it shall be my constant aim not only to preserve the things of worth in my native land, but to make them of still greater worth. So this then is the idea of these civic values. I'm going to protect my city-state. I'll never desert a comrade in arms. I'm going to protect government buildings and our places of worship and uphold the ideals of our country, whether working with others or working alone. I'll obey the law. I will observe the law that we make now, and I will protect and follow the laws that the majority, so the democracy, make in the future. If anyone seeks to change those laws in a bad way or to ignore them, I will oppose him, again, either with others or alone. And it's my goal to not just make this country the same, but to leave it better than I found it. And this is the purpose of this document, to kind of explore the idea that we have responsibilities and to lay out for people what their responsibilities as a citizen are. The other famous document from this time period, and specifically from Pericles, was the funeral oration, which is very, very long. You may have to do a reading on this, but let's go through a little bit of it. Our polity or government does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators ourselves. Our government is called a democracy because not the few, but the many govern. If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. If we look to social standing, advancement in public life falls to reputation for capacity, class considerations not being allowed to interfere with your merit or ability to succeed. Nor again does poverty bar the way. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered or stopped by the obscurity of his condition or his lack of money. So obviously he's biased for Athens, right? He's saying we don't copy the laws of others. We are the pattern that others copy because this democracy is in fact the best. Why? Because our democratic laws afford equal justice to all in their private differences. Because socially, we don't require people to have a social class. Yes, there are different social classes in Athens. There are wealthy and poor, but that doesn't interfere with their ability to serve. That we allow people with skill, with ability, to rise to the highest occasions. Whether that was true, well, that's up to, historians to kind of look at, and you maybe to look at someday too. But it's definitely an inspiring speech. So what are the effects of this golden age? Star this for me. When we talk about effects, this is getting into how something is significant, which becomes important for our essays we're going to write. How this thing is significant. Well, the golden age of Greece saw the birth of many new forms of thought. One of these was the expansion of philosophy, or the love of learning. Philo is love, Sophie is learning. And the ideas behind philosophy is the universe is put together by natural laws, that there are natural laws that govern the universe. People can understand these laws using logic and reason. And understanding the universe through philosophy is the highest good humans can achieve. And these guys aren't wrong. Like, there are natural laws such as thermodynamics, or you guys might be familiar with laws of gravity. And the philosophers maybe didn't get as high as laws of gravity. That's actually something we're going to learn about in Global 10. But they did want to understand what guides the universe around us. One of the greatest of these philosophers was a guy named Socrates, or if you're uncultured, you can call him Socrates. He came up with the Socratic method, the idea that you would keep questioning your students until they had achieved a total understanding of a subject. Um, this is actually a phenomenal method of teaching that is sometimes still used today. I feel like if I did this to you poor kids, you guys, your eyes would be rolling in the backs of your heads. But I just keep questioning you. I'd be like, well, why? But why? But why to that? But what's the reason for that? But why? Until you come to the root cause of an issue. He's the first to theorize that weather wasn't caused by the gods, but was in fact subsequent to natural laws. And in his lifetime, he gathered many students, many followers, but the powers that be, when he was alive, they thought that he was a threat to them. And because he doubted the power of the gods, they charged him with sacrilege or neglecting the gods. And he was given a choice: either flee Athens, go into exile, or die. And he's like, nope, Athens is the best city-state. I'd rather die here for my ideals. There's a very famous painting of Socrates still lecturing on the deathbed, being like, don't forget, question everything, while he's reaching for the cup of hemlock poison that he was forced to drink to kill him. Plato was a student of Socrates, so he learned of the Socratic method, and he would in turn use it on his own students as well. And he's famous for a variety of writings, the most famous of which is called The Republic. In The Republic, he explores different forms of government: monarchy, democracy, something called a timarchy, which we don't spend a lot of time on, but it's government by the military. And he reasons that the best society is, in fact, not a democracy. It's like a class system or a caste system where people are born, raised not by their families, but by the state, tested and sorted into different jobs based on, like, well, basically how smart they are. Now, this government never comes to be. The Republic, never gets created. It's just a theory. But the idea that having a king at the top who is kind of in charge and is a philosopher who understands the truth, that's going to influence feudalism later. He also creates arguably one of the first kind of colleges in Western Europe called the Academy that exists for 300 years as a major school. Aristotle was in turn a student of Plato, and he believed that humans' ability to be philosophers, to reason, to use logic, is what makes us unique and special amongst living organisms. He learned at Plato's Academy and later became the personal tutor of Alexander the Great. The Golden Age of Greece also saw incredible advances in Greek math and science. One of the most important of these individuals is Hippocrates. Hippocrates is kind of considered the father of modern medicine, in that he developed the process of clinical observation. Clinical observation is still used today. It's the idea that you record what's going on by your observations, that you look at symptoms like a fever or swollen lymph nodes in the neck, and you record down, well, what does this mean? Like, what's happening to this person? He explored family history. What did your father die of? Maybe you are also a risk of heart disease or heart attack. Now, he didn't use those terms, but he did understand that things that affect one person in a family might affect another. And he came up with the concept of the Hippocratic Oath, that first a doctor should do no harm. And most doctors throughout the world, other advances are made in other fields like mathematics. Euclid came up with the basics of modern day geometry, and his mathematics are still taught in school. You learned Euclid geometry. I mean, that is kind of the basis of how we build geometry in early types of mathematics. And why this is significant or important to us today is these foundations for math are set. And if you don't know this, like all modern engineering, large portions of modern chemistry and science are all based off of math. Without the groundwork these individuals are doing, the advances of later ages and later civilizations just cannot be. You have individuals like Pythagoras, who comes up with exploring triangles, another part of geometry. And his basic Pythagorean theorem allows the exploration of angles, which allows us to engineer larger edifices. And again, all of this is the groundwork for modern architecture, engineering, algebra, geometry. So obviously, the impact of these individuals lasts so much longer than probably even they could have envisaged. Other individuals from the Greek or Hellenistic world during this golden age include Eratosthenes. He measured the circumference of the earth using just math alone. Like he wasn't out there with a ruler. He used math, and he was pretty darn accurate. And he did a lot of other math that explored the accuracy of like concepts like a leap day and the leap year and things like that. Archimedes, I would say, is probably one of the most important of these individuals. He's technically not Greek, but he is living during this Greek golden age. And he actually specifically was from Sicily. And he is the first person to make a proof for the area of a circle. He explained the principle of levers. He measured specific gravity, which is very important for, well, brewing beer, quite frankly. He created weapons and inventions using this advanced mathematics. And he invented the water screw. The water screw allows you to take water from a low area and raise it up to a high one. And so this invention will then be used in irrigation, like for the rest of time. It also is used in ships to pump water out of ships at this time period. You know, ships sitting in water do take on water like a bilge pump. And that was the bilge pump of yesteryear. During the Greek Golden Age, and specifically in Athens, but in Greece as a whole, we saw the arts really take off. Specifically, theater. The Athenians were obsessed with theater and had these huge theater festivals every single year. And they created types of theater that we still use today. Drama, that was a type of Greek theater that they invented that word. The concept that you are going to talk about civil pride. There is going to be some drama, some sort of conflict that will be resolved in some way. They invented comedy, which was either slapstick, kind of goofy stuff. Lysistrata is both satire and goofy. And they invented tragedies, the idea that there's a tragic hero who has incredible gifts, but some sort of tragic flaw, some sort of error. Typically, it's like too much pride that eventually causes their downfall. One of the most famous playwrights was Sophocles, who wrote 123 different plays, out of which we have 7. His most famous 2 are Oedipus and Antigone, which if you want to explore, there's a cool crash course on Oedipus. And Antigone is kind of one of my favorite Greek plays, super, super sad. And you can find a YouTube video on that too. Greek architecture is also going to be incredibly influential. Both the design of a focal point for government administration, this Acropolis, will become a mainstay of many other city-states and empires. And under Pericles, the Acropolis was rebuilt using those funds from the Delian League. Ways we see the continuity of Greek ideas is their use of columns. Columns allowed you to use less building material, but still support the same amount of weight in a building. And they also, well, basically thought they looked nice. And so the use of columns becomes known as the classical style, based off of these ideas of balance, proportion, realism, which would also be found in their statues as well. These are 2 famous statues, Girl with Vase and Panocratia. Panocratia was like basically MMA, but there were almost no rules. In fact, only 2 rules. No gouging of the eyes and no biting of, people's genitals. And so it is like a precursor to MMA. And again, it's just so realistic with the muscles depicted here. The vase, the folds in the girl's robes. That's a hallmark of classical style. Keep that in mind because we'll be seeing classical style periodically throughout the year. Other elements of Greek architecture was the creation of the Parthenon. this famous massive statue complex to the goddess Athena because of her gifting victory to the Athenians in the Persian Wars and against their enemies. And this massive 30-foot tall statue to Athena herself that had been covered in gold. And in fact, all this gold armor was built on in plates, so if they needed to in emergency, they could take them off and melt them down for money. And all of this was built under the construction of Pericles. Greek culture, other elements of it, that they were polytheistic. They had a pantheon of gods who were, well, frequently related and intermarried with each other. The most famous, of course, is Zeus and Athena here. But you have their god of war, Ares. You have Mercury, Hephaestus is here. All sorts of different gods. There's, not Neptune, sorry, Poseidon. And they played a huge part in the world of the Greeks because they thought very much that the Greek gods were there watching them, that they were, jealous gods, that they were angry gods, that they could be wrathful gods. And so they did a lot of stuff to try and please the gods. A lot of it dealt with animal sacrifice. And they also had things like the Olympics to please the gods. These were these massive sports competitions held every 4 years in the shadow of the holy mountain of Zeus. They were dedicated to Zeus. They would have foot races, wrestling, boxing, jumping, all sorts of different stuff. And the prize for winning this was a simple olive wreath called a laurel. We're going to see laurels throughout the year because the Greeks used it to symbolize victory and excellence. It, throughout Western civilizations, becomes the symbol of victory, of excellence. And here you have a statue of one of these Olympiads. And again, that idea of balance, harmony, realism, all the muscles defined. And then you can see this balance through this end and this leg on the same axis, showing that idea of form and function in this classical style of Greek art. Our last major event in Greek history is the Peloponnesian War. Eventually, members of the Delian League sought to leave the Delian League. They wanted to end their membership. And Athens refused. Athens said, well, no. They had become accustomed to being the leader of the Greek world. They'd been accustomed to the wealth and the money that flowed in from this league. And when a couple of these city-states tried to leave, and Athens sent navies and armies to keep them in, Sparta got involved. And what devolved was this incredibly long 27-year war. Athens had the advantage on the sea. They had the most powerful fleet. Sparta had the better soldiers and ruled the land. And neither side wanted to commit all of their soldiers for fear of losing. So it really turned into what's called a proxy war, that the Athenians would send some of their troops to a city-state allied to them. The Spartans would send some of their soldiers to a city-state allied with them. And it would be these other city-states that would fight on behalf. This war was recorded, like the Persian War that was written about after by the first historian Herodotus. The Peloponnesian War was recorded by another historian, Thucydides. And Thucydides builds on the ideas of Herodotus of using evidence and collecting evidence and talking to eyewitnesses. But he also does not attribute things to like the gods. Like Herodotus would write down anything people told him. Thucydides is going to try to use reason and logic to ascertain what the truth was, like who might be lying, who might be biased. And he acknowledged that, I'm trying to write the history as it was, but some of my witnesses are, in fact, biased. So that was pretty huge of him alone to acknowledge that bias can exist. His writings, the speeches in this book, are still part of international politics, still studied in military academies and political science colleges as well. And at the end of the day, he kind of blames Athens, but he does put some blame on both sides. He says the cause of all these evils, the war, was the lust for power arising from greed and ambition. And from these passions proceeded the violence of parties once engaged in contention. And this war is brutal because it's between former allies. The Athenians and the Spartans had fought together against the Persians just a couple decades before, and now they become the bitterest, most violent of enemies of each other. We have this famous document called the Melian Dialogue, which is an examination of realpolitik, or the politics of reality. You have the Athenians, who say, "For ourselves we shall not trouble you with the specious pretenses, either of how we have the right to our empire, because we overthrew the Persians, or are now attacking you because of wrong that you have done us, and make a long speech which would not be believed, and in return we hope that you, instead of thinking to influence us by saying that you did not join the Spartans, although they're colonists, or that you have done us no wrong, will aim at what is feasible, holding in view the real sentiments of us both, since you know as well as we do that right, as the world goes, is the only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Of the gods we believe, and of men we know, that by a necessary law of their nature they rule wherever they can. And it is not as if we were the first to make this law, or to act upon it when made. We found it existing before us, and shall leave it to exist forever after us. All we do is make use of it, knowing that you and everybody else, having the same power as we have, would do the same as we do. And really what this is them justifying their empire. That we are strong right now, and we will claim an empire. And you, the weaker, will have to become part of it. Unfortunately, the Athenians were not quite correct in this, and they begin to lose this 27-year war. A massive plague breaks out, killing nearly 1/3 of Athenians' population. Their men can no longer fight. They're walled up behind their city under siege by the Spartans, and they surrender. Athens is an economic ruin and political chaos. The democracy breaks down, and they're ruled by a series of kings and oligarchies or aristocrats that Sparta supported. They wanted them. And at the end of the war, Sparta is at the height of their power. They have won this great battle, but they too have suffered fearsome casualties. Their kings are considered corrupt by having spent too much time out of Sparta properly. And basically, their power over Greece will erode over the next 100 years, setting the stage for a new conqueror of Greece. Thanks for joining.